There are many individuals in the history of Kazakhstan who left a bright trace in the annals of the country and the world. Some of them were born and worked in Kazakhstan, others have lived in the country for only a few years. Every city of Kazakhstan has buildings that allow us to touch the life of such people. The names of many iconic individuals are associated with a street in the city of Almaty. In the second half of the 20th century, famous writers, scholars, and politicians lived here. The district at one time received the nickname Tsar's Village. The location was convenient for both party leaders and cultural workers, because there was an Academy of Science and a government house nearby. Everything was located in a very convenient part of the city. It feels like you are not in the city, and nevertheless, you are in the very center of Almaty. Perhaps one of the first residents thanks to whom the district acquired such high status was the Kazakh writer Mukhtar Auezov, whose name is known to the whole world. Today, his works have been translated into more than 120 languages. The interest towards his work only grows with time. He's very talented. He wrote The Path of Abai, a very significant work. Not only because he opened Abai to us, but also because he was able to convey the atmosphere of the Kazakh steppe and people so accurately and vividly. It's like an encyclopedia of that time. In 1949, Mukhtar Auezov was awarded the Stalin Prize in Literature and Art. This was one of the highest awards of the Soviet Union. The writer received it for the novel Abai, which was subsequently continued by the author and became the epic, The Path of Abai. In 1949, Mukhtar Auezov won the state prize. At the time, the award was 100,000 rubles. Using this money, he bought a piece of land. At the time, 2 teachers lived here. He bought it, and the construction of this house began. Georgy Gerasimov, an architect and honored builder of the Kazakh SSR who built the Almaty Opera House and the Government House, took up the development of the project. He also became a co-author of this project. Interestingly enough, this house was designed in collaboration with the writer himself. Gerasimov was an architect, but as far as I know, many of Auezov's wishes were taken into consideration. The foundation of the building was laid in 1950, and already in 1951, Auezov wrote to his colleague, writer Zoya Kudrina, that at the end of June of that year, he and his whole family moved into a new house. It is the house where he lived and worked during the last years of his life. In this house, he wrote a lot of literature works, including some of his famous works, the last 2 books of The Path of Abai. Also his second novel, which is called Young Tribe, as well as one of his favorite plays, Dos Bedel Dos. It was about his faithful friend, his dog. Many art critics and experts believe that while working on the project of his house, Mukhtar Auezov took as an example the house of Leo Tolstoy, one of his favorite writers. Of course, the residence of the Kazakh writer cannot be considered a copy of Yasnaya Polyana, but some coincidences allow us to believe that this version is quite justified. A few years ago, employees of the Leo Tolstoy House Museum came to visit. They confirmed that the study at Auezov's house is very similar to the one at Yasnaya Polyana. In 1961, after the death of Mukhtar Auezov, his relatives proposed the government an idea to create a house museum at Mukhtar Auezov's residence. The corresponding decree was signed almost immediately. The scale of Auezov's figure did not raise any doubts. The house opened its doors for visitors 2 years later, in 1963. Both in the study and in the rooms, the interior was recreated with maximum precision, just like during the writer's lifetime. This is a place where a lot of information is concentrated about the era, about people, about how people lived. When you enter this house, look around, observe its details, look at the windows, at the arches of the windows, the pillars or doors. You understand that this house is located in Central Asia, in Almaty. Because this geometry, this plastic, the use of materials, all this, of course, reflects the context and the place.
Потому что вот эта геометрия, эта пластика, использование материалов, это все, конечно же, передает, оно транслирует контекст, он транслирует место.
In 56 years that have passed since the opening of the House Museum of Mukhtar Auezov, its territory has changed. By the end of the 1990s of the last century, a new building was built, intended for researchers, as well as for the library and the museum itself.
Первая проблема.
The first problem was placing it in the cramped space of an existing house. There was a cozy, pretty courtyard, and so we decided to build a new building underground. There were such examples in the world architecture before.
Решил его утопить под землю. В принципе, в мировой архитектуре такие были примеры.
The solution allowed to keep the garden adjacent to the house of Auezov. There are still trees, some of which were planted by the writer himself. There are 2 walnut trees that Mukhtar Auezov planted in 1955. We distribute the fruits of this tree among visitors, as well as participants of the essay competition, to school children from the 9th to the 11th grade. In the late 1960s, Din Muhammad Kunaev settled on the same street, a man who held the post of the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Republic of Kazakhstan from 1960 to 1986. Leonid Brezhnev can be considered the initiator of the construction of this house. During one of his visits in the mid-1960s, Din Muhammad Kunaev invited him to his house. At the time, he lived on the corner of Kommunisticheskaya Avenue and Kirov Street. Though it was a 3-bedroom apartment, it was still a rather small apartment. Leonid Brezhnev was surprised and said that, in his opinion, the head of such a large, rich republic should live in a more comfortable condition. From 1969 until his death in 1993, Din Muhammad Kunaev lived in this apartment. During the years when the country was headed by Din Muhammad Kunaev, many buildings appeared in Almaty. They were and still to this day are the calling cards of the city. The Palace of the Republic, the Circus, the legendary Kokteby Tower, the famous Arsan bathhouse are only a small part of them. Kunaev was directly involved in the construction of all major architectural structures, all the main monuments of our country, of our city. This does not mean that he was a builder. He visited construction sites, he tracked the construction progress and the completion. This is a very important contribution, I believe, because very often party leaders were not very involved in the general culture, the image of the city. The influence of Din Muhammad Kunaev on the formation of the architectural landscape of the ex-capital of the Kazakh Republic was enormous. With his participation, Almaty acquired its unique, inimitable image.
Он оставил, конечно, большой след. Без него Алмата не было бы.
Of course, he left a significant mark. Without him, Almaty would not be the same city we know and remember. Among experts, it's believed that Almaty is the capital of Soviet modernism because many interesting buildings of that style were preserved here, as well as new buildings from 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
Таких объектов.
When work on the Kunaev's house began, at first it was assumed that the building would be entirely allotted for the residence of the first Secretary of the Republic. Moreover, it was dictated by both the status of Kunaev and his safety requirements. This is a special construction. At the time, during the Soviet period, such houses were specially built for the first secretaries. Kirov and other eminent personalities had such houses. But at the stage of laying the foundation, Kunaev decided that the whole house for him alone was unaffordable luxury and insisted that the building be divided for several families. As a result, architect Bronislav Dmitrievsky designed the house for 9 apartments. Dinmuhamed Kunaev and his wife Zuhra Sharipovna settled in one of them, a spacious one, but according to modern standards, very modest one. One of the rooms was reserved for the study, with a huge library and favored collection of lighters of Kunaev. He collected it from the mid-1940s of the last century. Most of them, of course, were purchased by him. They are gifts from relatives, but there is a special category of lighters which during official visits were given to him by famous people. In particular, there is a lighter which was presented to Kunaev by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Anthony Eden, in 1956 during his visit to the UK. It is made in the form of a 2-volume book by Shakespeare. At the moment, a scientific work based on the letters of Kunaev is going on at the museum. The correspondence is vast, several thousand letters. Letters from all over the Soviet Union and from abroad, from the leaders of the states, from film directors, from relatives and ordinary people, some written by children. All were read by Dinmuhamed Kunaev and carefully stored. Marshal Bagramyan wrote, "We consider you to be the same military officer as we were, because during the war you did no less, if not more." During World War II, Kazakhstan was the main center of the military industry of the Soviet Union and made an invaluable contribution to the common victory. According to statistics, 9 out of 10 bullets at the front were cast in Kazakhstan. Back then, Dinmuhamed Kunaev was responsible for overseeing the defense industry, transport, and communications. Dinmuhamed Kunaev moved here in 1942 from Rieder. He was appointed as a deputy chairman of the People's Commissars. At the time, it was the same position as the vice prime minister today. He was the second person who oversaw the Soviet industry. Defense factories were all evacuated here. We were a frontline zone in World War II, and therefore the factories were evacuated from Russia and from other socialist republics to Kazakhstan. Dinmuhamed Kunaev oversaw their operation. This house in the city of Ural in the west of Kazakhstan is also related to a person of historical scale, but more of an ancient times. Yemelyan Pugachev, or Tsar Peter Fedorovich, rebel. At the end of the 18th century, he stirred the entire Russian Empire. We all know the history of Yemelyan Pugachev from school program, and we know naturally that it's inextricably linked with Ural city. Therefore, I believe that everyone who comes to Ural must visit the Pugachev Museum, because it is a pearl. It is one of the attractions of Ural. Having called himself Tsar Peter Fedorovich in 1773, Yemelyan Pugachev stood at the head of a rebellion, unprecedented in Russia at that time. At the height of the uprising, his army had up to 120,000 soldiers. The Cossack town of Yaik became his main base of operations. And here, in this house, Pugachev met his new empress. The house belonged to Cossack Peter Kuznetsov from Yaitsk. Here he lived with his family. But in 1774, with the support of the local Cossacks, Yemelyan Pugachev married Peter Kuznetsov's daughter, Ustinya. Ustinya's parents tried to prevent the marriage. How there can be any thought about the wedding if Tsar's wife, Mother Empress Catherine the Great, is still in power? But they did not dare to argue with Pugachev. In February 1774, the wedding took place. Portraits of Pugachev and his wife are painted based on stories and memories. How did Ustinya Kuznetsova actually look like is unknown. During her lifetime, her appearance was not captured. Our museum has another invaluable exhibit. This is the royal throne. Although we cannot unequivocally say that Yemelyan Pugachev was sitting on it, but in every city he conquered, he was greeted with such a throne. Its distinctive feature that it was made without a single nail. This is a genuine historical object of the 18th century. Whether it is a right copy of the throne or not, but Emelian Pugachev did not hold the throne for a long time. 2 years after the beginning of the uprising, after several defeats, his army started to rapidly decrease, and there was no longer enough strength to continue the war. In 1775, the famous generalissimo Suvorov caught Pugachev under Tsaritsyn and delivered him to Moscow, and there on Bolotnaya Square, Pugachev was executed. For the edification of possible followers, Pugachev was driven across the country in a cage, and then, for perfect oblivion of what happened, Catherine the Great commands to rename the capital of the uprising. Henceforth, the city of Yaitsk is called Uraysk, was written in her decree. The new name has survived to this day, however, as well as the memory of the controversial figure of Emelian Pugachev. I have been interested in history for about a year, and the history of the 18th and 19th centuries seems especially interesting to me. One of the most famous museums in the city is the Pugachev Museum. In this museum, there are many interesting exhibits. For example, visitors can see a lot of things that Pugachev used himself. Today, I learned a lot of interesting things for myself. The history of the city of Pavlodar in eastern Kazakhstan is nearly 300 years old. During this time, from a small outpost, it turned into an industrial center of the republic. But one can witness what was the city like 100 years ago at the House Museum of Dmitry Bagayev, a photographer known far beyond Kazakhstan. The museum in the house where Bagayev lived and worked was opened in 2001. People came here from all over the city to take photos, both artistic and official. Today, the author's personal belongings and part of his works are collected here. Yes, and the building itself is preserved almost intact.
Здание музея имеет
The museum building has historical architectural significance. This is a monument to the Philistine life of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Our building has 3 exposition halls, a photo gallery, and a reserved manor.
экспозиционных, фотопавильон и заповедную усадьбу.
Dmitry Bagayev was born in 1884 in what was then Russia, but at the invitation of his uncle as a teenager, he moved to Pavlodar. By the age of 16, he was already working in the mining society of the local merchant Derov. Although not for long, the passion for photography took over, and it changed his fate.
Благодаря великим шедеврам великого фотографа мы с вами
Thanks to the great masterpieces of the great photographer, we have the opportunity to plunge into the end of the 19th century.
степного народа.
See the life of the steppe people, in general the life of Pavlodar-Yurtis area.
Значение
The great meaning of the photos, that life events that took place on the territory of Pavlodar-Yurtis region, they were all captured by the great photographer.
как бы те события, которые происходили на территории Павлодарского Прииртышья, они были отражены в фотографиях великого фотографа.
In total, Dmitry Bagayev took more than 1,000 photographs throughout his life. Pavlodar was not the only place that got into his photo lens. The photographer often traveled outside the city, to Ekabastus, Semey, Oskimen, and Balkhash. Sometimes Bagayev shot him something that the authorities did not approve of. For example, a photo of 1907 called By the Stage. It captured political prisoners. It was extremely dangerous to photograph something like this, but in the end, this shot was known all over the world.
Уникальность этого музея в том, что посетитель здесь может увидеть.
The uniqueness of this museum is that the visitor can see the exhibits from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Here we see a camera.
Здесь мы видим фотоаппарат.
This is the constant companion of Dmitry Bagayev and his expeditions. On this display, visitors can see an album from the end of the 19th century made of genuine leather. If you look closely, you can see that the clasp is made in the form of the royal crown.
Если присмотреться, то можно увидеть, что застежка в виде царской короны.
Students of Pavlodar State University who came from Nigeria are visiting the museum for the first time. They came not by chance. They say they want to learn more about the history of the people with whom today they live side by side.
Museums generally they remind us of the importance of our history. And it's a good thing to come here and see the history of the olden days of Pavlodar. I'm happy to be here, and truth be told, I'm happy to know the man called Bagayev. Okay, I'm happy to know him and even know the history of Pavlodar. When I got here at first, truth be told, I was impressed. Like, I passed through here every day, so I never knew. Like, I used to see the symbol outside, the sign outside, so I never knew there's a museum here, truth be told, because I walk through this place every day. So, entering this place for the first time today, I'm happy. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be part of this.
Another famous person who left a mark on the history of Pavlodar got on the lands of Bagayev as a child. Pavel Vasilyev, a Soviet poet who shared the sad fate of many writers of that era. He was arrested for his poems and shot in 1937. There is a museum dedicated to his memory in the city. The house of Pavel Vasilyev, where he spent his childhood, of course, was not as small as our house museum. On this side, there was a farm building. As it is written in the contract for the sale of 2 rooms, there was a bathhouse, a barn, it was all here. But the house itself was longer, and the exit was on Dostoevsky Street. Pavel Vasilyev wrote his first poems in this room. His first audience was his mother and grandfather. His father did not support the hobby of his son. He believed that poetry is not a suitable business for a man. Today, Pavel Vasilyev is considered to be the predecessor of the heroic period in Russian literature. They say that Vasilyev is a unifying poet. It's true. Through his life example, through his creativity, he united a lot of cities, both of Kazakhstan and Russia. In his poems, there are many cities of Kazakhstan. He dedicated his poems to Semey, Pavlodar, and of course to Zaysan, to Vladivostok, and to Moscow. In general, he is a Eurasian poet. This is the most important thing in the works of Pavel Vasilyev, that he is a Eurasian poet. He was one of the first poets in the Soviet poetry who praised Kazakhstan. In the 1930s, Pavel Vasilyev was detained 3 times. He was accused of either counter-revolutionary activities or malicious hooliganism and an immoral lifestyle. The arrest in 1937 was the last one. This time, the poet was suspected of participating in the terrorist group that allegedly plotted to assassinate Stalin. The maximum severe sentence execution was carried out almost immediately. Many years later, Vasilyev's story became known to the general public, in large part thanks to Pavlodar journalist and literary critic Sergei Muzalevsky. It was he who did everything possible to rehabilitate the name of the poet in 1956, and with his direct participation, it was possible to open the House Museum of Pavel Vasilyev.
Конечно же, постарались воссоздать.
We tried to recreate the house as it was, but it is a little different. The most important thing, as Elena Alexandrovna, his widow, pointed out, that the museum is located on the same land where Vasilyev spent his childhood, on Yirtis. He opened his windows, and there it was, the Yirtis. He spent days on end on the river Yirtis. Elena Vyalova, his widow, made a huge contribution. Thanks to her help, it was possible to open the museum. What I want to especially note, she gave the first exhibits for the museum. And since December 3, 1994, this house was consecrated. And now here we are, at the House Museum of Pavel Vasilyev.
Осветили, и теперь находимся здесь мы, Дом-музей Павла Васильева.
Today, the House Museums hold regular meetings with school children and students. The preserved interior attracts Vasilyev fans from around the world. However, there are no manuscripts of the poet here. After the verdict, the copies of Vasilyev's works were destroyed. People were afraid that they could be arrested for keeping the banned literature. The history of each city and each country is first of all the history of the people who created it. It is stored on book pages, in handwritten canvases, in frames of photo chronicles, and in the memory of contemporaries. And when we can see with our own eyes the buildings associated with them, our understanding of the scale of their personalities becomes much deeper.